Marcus Vance was not a man given to flights of fancy. For 32 years, he had served as the director of night operations and security for Apex Logistics, a sprawling 2 million square foot automated fulfillment center in the industrial heart of Kent, Washington. His world had been governed by binary absolutes: open or closed, secure or breached, authorized or unauthorized. He had overseen the transition from analog padlocks and physical night watchmen to biometric scanners, thermal imaging drones, and AI-driven predictive security algorithms. Over 3 decades, he had successfully dealt with armed cargo hijackers, disgruntled employees, corporate saboteurs, and meth-addicted copper thieves. He trusted systems, he trusted data. He possessed a pragmatic, fearless demeanor, fundamentally anchored in the belief that absolutely nothing existed in the dark that could not be explained by a police report, a psychiatric evaluation, or basic physics. Retirement, however, was proving to be an entirely different sort of beast. 6 months ago, Marcus and his wife, Helen, had downsized to a quiet, tree-lined cul-de sac in Asakwa, a wealthy suburb nestled directly against the dense ancient evergreen foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The transition from the hyper-illuminated, relentlessly humming warehouse to the profound, oppressive quiet of the forest edge had left Marcus restless. To cope, he had essentially turned their 4-bedroom craftsman home into a suburban fortress. High-definition motion sensor cameras monitored every sightline. Window contacts, glass break sensors, and a reinforced steel core in the front door provided a blanket of digital and physical security. Yet, for the past 3 weeks, the systems had been failing him. It started with the perimeter alerts. His smartphone would buzz at 3 a.m., the app notifying him of motion-detected backyard. Marcus would pull up the live feed, his tactical flashlight already in hand, only to find the infrared camera capturing nothing but the empty patio and the rain. Then came the physical anomalies. A smudge of foul-smelling, luminescent green residue smeared across the lens of the garage camera. The motion floodlights burning out weeks after installation. Most unnerving of all was the doggy door in the kitchen. Their golden retriever, Buster, had passed away 2 years prior. But Marcus had left the heavy-duty, magnetic flap installed out of a mixture of sentimentality and procrastination. Lately, Marcus would wake up to find the heavy plastic flap swinging gently, clicking back and forth in the dead air of the house, as if something small had just scurried through. He rationalized it, of course. Raccoons, he told himself. A draft from the HVAC system, software artifacts on the cameras. His mind, forged in logic, refused to entertain any other possibility. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon in late November, the kind of day that defined the Pacific Northwest winter outside. A relentless atmospheric river was dumping sheets of icy, gray rain onto the cedar shingles. The heavy overcast sky smothered the daylight, plunging the house into a premature, gloomy twilight. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a picture of domestic warmth. The central heating hummed a low, comforting bass line. From the kitchen, the rich, savory aroma of Helen's slow-cooking chuck roast, simmering with carrots and rosemary, drifted through the halls. Marcus was sprawled on the oversized leather sofa in the living room, a thick wool blanket pulled over his chest. The television was on, casting a flickering light across his weathered face as the Seattle Seahawks battled the San Francisco 49ers. The drone of the announcers and the muffled roar of the televised crowd acted as a lullaby. Marcus felt his eyelids growing heavy. The persistent, paranoid tension that had gripped his neck for the past few weeks finally began to unclench. He surrendered to the warmth, drifting into the hazy liminal space between wakefulness and deep sleep. Then, the sensation began. It was distinct, undeniable, and entirely physical. Something light, yet possessing a dense, concentrated weight, was slowly crawling up his shins. He felt the unmistakable prick of sharp individual points, claws pressing through the thick wool blanket, catching the fibers. Marcus didn't panic immediately. His conscious mind, still sluggish from sleep, reached for the most logical explanation. It is the Miller's stray tabby cat, he thought, mildly annoyed. The little menace must have pushed through the old doggy door again. He cracked his right eye open, preparing to aggressively shoo the animal away. The breath hitched in his throat, and the temperature in his blood seemed to plummet to absolute zero. Squatting directly on his kneecaps, pinning the blanket to his legs, was an aberration of nature. It roughly shared the skeletal proportions of a large, urban coyote, but the similarities ended there in a grotesque fashion. Its fur was an unnatural, sickly shade of jaundiced yellow, mottled with patches of raw, gray, leathery skin. But it was the creature's mouth that triggered a primal, deep-seated revulsion in Marcus's gut. The fur and flesh around its elongated snout were stained a vibrant, luminescent, mossy green, the exact color of the residue he had been scrubbing off his security cameras. The green sludge dripped slowly from its jagged needle, like teeth sizzling faintly as it hit the wool blanket, smelling sharply of ozone and battery acid. As the creature shifted its weight, it moved with an eerie liquid grace. Its joints didn't seem to articulate like a mammal's. Instead, its limbs flowed and adjusted with a serpentine fluidity that defied skeletal anatomy. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His logical brain short-circuited, desperately cycling through explanations. A rabid animal, a mutated stray, a hallucination brought on by a microstroke. He tried to chuckle inwardly, a defense mechanism born of pure denial. How did a diseased mangy coyote bypass a state-of-the-art home security perimeter? The creature slithered higher, moving up his thighs and onto his stomach. It froze, suddenly locking its gaze onto his face. Its eyes were the most terrifying feature of all. They were entirely pupil, horizontal and rectangular like a goat's, but radiating a freezing, icy blue luminescence. There was no feral panic in those eyes, no animalistic hunger. There was only a profound, malicious, and ancient intelligence. The moment eye contact was made, Marcus felt a terrifying, electric jolt violently snap through his central nervous system. It wasn't a physical blow, but a neurological override. Where the creature's forepaws pressed into his chest, a deep, numbing cold exploded outward. It felt as though someone had injected liquid nitrogen directly into his aorta. Within milliseconds, the cold cascaded down his arms and legs. His muscles, toned from years of physical labor and warehouse patrols, turned to useless, heavy lead. Absolute terrifying paralysis took hold. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move his head. He couldn't even blink. He was a prisoner inside his own skull, completely at the mercy of the impossible weight sitting on his sternum, slowly compressing his lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm him. In the deepest, darkest recesses of his mind, buried beneath decades of corporate logistics and security protocols, an ancient memory surfaced. He remembered his grandmother, a stern woman from the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, sitting on a porch in the sweltering summer heat, warning him about the night hag. She had spoken of witches' familiars, demons that rode the chests of the sleeping, casting binding spells to steal the breath from the living. As a boy, Marcus had dismissed it as ignorant folklore. Now, feeling the supernatural, suffocating weight of the beast, the myth had violently manifested into his reality. But Marcus Vance was not a man who surrendered. He had stared down men with loaded shotguns in the backlots of Kent. He was not going to be suffocated on his own couch by a fairy tale. He realized that the creature's power lay in its unbroken, hypnotic stare. The icy blue eyes were the conduit for the paralysis. He couldn't move his limbs, but he could control his mind. Marcus stopped fighting the full-body paralysis and concentrated every ounce of his consciousness, every shred of his rage and willpower into a single focal point, the index finger of his right hand resting unseen beneath the blanket. Move, he commanded his nervous system, move. He waited. The creature lowered its snout, the smell of rotting meat and sulfur washing over Marcus's face. It was savoring his terror suddenly from the television. The shrill, piercing shriek of a referee's whistle cut through the tension. A penalty on the play. The sudden electronic noise startled the beast. For a fraction of a millisecond, its ears twitched backward, and it broke eye contact, snapping its grotesque head toward the television screen. The icy grip on Marcus's nervous system fractured. Marcus seized the microscopic window of opportunity. He didn't try to sit up. He violently pushed through the heavy magical blanket, pinning his mind down, channeling a lifetime of adrenaline and survival instinct. With a guttural, terrifying roar that tore his throat raw, Marcus surged upward from the cushions, his large, calloused hands possessing a grip strength built over 30 years of hauling pallets and restraining trespassers, snapped out like steel traps. He bypassed the snapping jaws and wrapped his fingers fiercely around the creature's scrawny, matted neck. The moment his skin made contact with the beast, a wave of nauseating static electricity shocked his palms. But he ignored the pain. He squeezed, his thumbs digging deep into the creature's windpipe. The beast thrashed wildly, its liquid joints snapping and popping as it tried to contort its way out of the chokehold. It let out a cry that froze the blood in Marcus's veins. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded horrifically human, exactly like a terrified toddler screaming in the middle of a crowded grocery store. High-pitched, desperate, and deeply uncanny Helen. Marcus bellowed at the top of his lungs, the veins bulging dangerously in his neck and forehead. Helen, get in here now. The creature's claws found Marcus's forearms, tearing through his thick flannel shirt and slicing into his flesh. Hot blood ran down his wrists. But Marcus only tightened his grip, his face a mask of primal fury. In the kitchen, the sound of a metal basting spoon clattering against the tile floor echoed sharply. Helen sprinted into the living room. She had been an emergency room triage nurse for 20 years before retiring. She was intimately familiar with blood, chaos, and crisis. Yet, Seeing her pragmatic, stoic husband wrestling a snarling, bioluminescent yellow nightmare on their living room sofa caused her to freeze in absolute shock for 2 full seconds. "Don't just stand there," Marcus grunted, his arms shaking from the effort of holding the violently thrashing creature away from his face. "Garage. My toolbox. Get the heavy-duty zip ties and the paracord. The thick ones." Helen's training kicked in, overriding her disbelief. She didn't ask questions. She spun on her heel and sprinted to the garage. She returned less than 15 seconds later, her hands full of thick, black, industrial-grade HVAC zip ties, the kind rated for 175 pounds of tensile strength, and a coil of braided Kevlar core nylon rope. "Legs first," Marcus barked, shifting his weight to pin the creature's upper body against the back of the sofa. Working together, moving with the unspoken synchronization of a veteran trauma team. They went to work. The creature bucked and screamed with that horrifying childlike wail, snapping its acid-dripping jaws. Marcus muscled the beast off the sofa and slammed it down onto a sturdy, oak dining chair that Helen pulled over. While Marcus kept the neck pinned, Helen expertly looped the thick plastic ties around its hind legs, binding them to the wooden chair legs, pulling the ratchets tight until the plastic audibly clicked and bit deep into the yellow fur. She repeated the process with the front limbs, then used the Kevlar rope to lash its torso securely to the backrest of the chair, tying complex, slip-proof knots she'd learned from decades of securing combative patients. Finally, Marcus stepped back. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving, blood dripping slowly from the deep scratches on his forearms onto the Persian rug. The creature was immobilized, bound tight to the heavy oak chair in the center of the living room. A triumphant, cynical grin spread across Marcus's sweaty face. The adrenaline was overriding the sheer impossibility of the situation. He had relied on his physical strength and his tools, and he had won. "Thought you could put a spell on me in my own house, did you?" Marcus taunted, his voice ragged but dripping with vindication. He wiped a mixture of sweat and blood from his brow. "Thought you could bypass the perimeter. Let's see you magic your way out of industrial-grade polyethylene and Kevlar." The creature suddenly stopped struggling. The wailing ceased instantly. The ferocious thrashing halted. It went completely limp against the ropes, as if all the life had been drained from it. But it wasn't dead. It slowly raised its head and stared directly at Marcus. The icy blue horizontal eyes no longer held panic. Instead, a look of profound, alien arrogance crossed its features. It looked at the zip ties, then looked back at Marcus, and if a snout could form a smirk, this creature was smiling. Then the laws of physics simply ceased to apply in the Vance living room. The creature's body began to warp. A sickening wet crack echoed through the room as its ribcage voluntarily collapsed inward. The sound of shifting cartilage and grinding bone was deafening. Right before Marcus and Helen's horrified eyes, the creature's torso elongated and compressed, shrinking down into a bizarre, snake-like tube of gristle, muscle, and fur, no thicker than a man's wrist. Because the mass of the creature had vanished, the unyielding zip ties and the tight knots of the Kevlar rope were suddenly holding nothing but empty air. Without making a single sound, the tubular serpentine monstrosity slithered effortlessly through the tight gaps in the bindings, dropping freely to the wooden seat of the chair. "Get it," Marcus yelled, his brain finally comprehending the impossible escape. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight toward the chair, desperately reaching out with his bloody hands to grab the creature before it could hit the floor. But the moment Marcus's fingertips grazed the frayed edge of the nylon rope, the creature invoked its second, and far more terrifying trick. It violently inflated. In a fraction of a millisecond, the thin, snake-like tube expanded outward with explosive, kinetic force. It didn't just return to its original coyote size, it kept growing, ballooning into a massive, barrel-thick mass of pulsing, jaundiced muscle and fur. For a terrifying second, an entity the size and density of a mature black bear occupied the space of the dining chair. The sheer outward pressure of the sudden expansion was catastrophic. The industrial zip ties didn't just break, they detonated. The 175-pound rated plastic snapped like brittle twigs, sending sharp black shards flying across the living room like shrapnel, embedding themselves into the drywall. The Kevlar core nylon rope stretched to its absolute limit before snapping with a loud percussive crack that sounded like a gunshot. Stunned by the concussive force and the sheer impossibility of the changing mass, Marcus staggered backward, throwing his arms up to shield his face from the flying plastic shrapnel. Helen screamed, covering her head. In that exact fraction of a second, while Marcus was blinded, the beast deflated just as rapidly. The massive bear-sized entity instantly collapsed back down, but this time it didn't return to the coyote shape. It turned incredibly slick and elongated, its fur instantly matting down until it resembled a massive 6-foot moray eel coated in thick black viscous grease. It slid completely off the chair, hitting the hardwood floor without making a single sound. No footfalls, no thud, just a silent, frictionless glide. It whipped its body in an S-curve, completely ignoring Marcus and Helen, and shot straight toward the kitchen. Marcus dropped his arms just in time to see the greasy, black tail of the entity disappear through the plastic flaps of the old doggy door. It darted out into the relentless freezing rain and vanished instantly into the dense, dark hedges of the suburban perimeter. Silence slammed back into the house, broken only by the television commentators calmly analyzing a replay, and the relentless drumming of the rain against the windows. Marcus and Helen stood frozen in the center of their living room for a very long time. The smell of pot roast had been entirely overpowered by the lingering stench of ozone, sulfur, and battery acid. They stared silently at the shattered wooden chair, the black plastic shrapnel embedded in their walls, and the frayed broken remnants of Kevlar rope scattered across the blood-stained Persian rug. Marcus slowly looked down at his bleeding arms. The physical proof of an encounter his logical mind still screamed was impossible. He had spent 30 years building impenetrable physical security, trusting in cameras, locks, and sensors. In 3 minutes, a creature from a forgotten nightmare had proved that true security was an illusion, and that some intruders don't just bypass the gates, they bypass reality itself. From that day forward, the leather sofa was removed from the living room, dragged out to the curb in the pouring rain. The magnetic doggy door in the kitchen was violently ripped out, the hole filled with concrete blocks, mortar, and steel rebar by Marcus's own hands. And in the Vance household, despite the reinforced doors and the state-of-the-art cameras, neither Marcus nor Helen ever dared to close their eyes while the sun was up again.